In Part 6, we joined the Achille Lauro for the final leg of an 11-night Mediterranean cruise from Genoa in late 1994. Sadly, unbeknownst to us at the time, this would be one of her last cruises before she caught fire and sank off Somalia a mere 6 weeks later. On the morning of October 4th, while the ship was at sea between Piraeus and Capri, we joined the chief engineer for a tour of the control room. But before we begin, let's have a recap for those who missed the prior episodes in this series. In Part 1, we traced the remarkable history of the Achille Lauro, beginning with her time on the stocks at the De Schelde shipyard in Flushing, Holland, where she was miraculously spared bombing during World War II. She would be completed in 1947 as the Dutch liner Willem Reis for line voyage service to Indonesia. In 1964, she was sold to Lauro Lines and given a complete transformation into the stylish emigrant liner Achille Lauro. Her many brushes with fate would include several fires, a collision, and a notorious hijacking until her sad demise, and yet she was a fiercely loved and popular ship to the end. In Part 2, we provide a deck-by-deck, top-to-bottom tour of Achille Lauro in her final year, covering all deck areas and public rooms. In Part 3, the Achille Lauro's voyage begins at Genoa. In addition to the Achille Lauro, what made this trip so memorable were all the other ships we would encounter, including the failed American Adventure, which was being converted back to the Costa Riviera. In Naples, on the second day, we shared the port with the Royal Odyssey and the then state-of-the-art Costa Romantica. On the third day, we visited Syracuse with no other ships, and the fourth was a glorious day at sea. Part 4 begins at dawn in the harbor of Alexandria, which was littered with wrecks, weathered merchant ships, and a miraculous sight, the Egyptian royal yacht MAHROUSSA, which was built in 1865. We then embarked on a full-day tour of Cairo and the pyramids, rejoining Achille Lauro at the end of a long pontoon in Port Said. Our next port was Ashdod in Israel, where we took an excursion to Jerusalem. In Limassol, Cyprus, we spent a busy day photographing numerous ships, including the Princesa Cypria and Princesa Marissa of Lewis Cruises, Salamis Line's Nissos Kypros, and the classic ATALANTE, the former Tahitian of Messageries Maritimes. After Limassol, we enjoyed a relatively low-key day in Rhodes, where Achille Lauro was the only cruise ship in port. We then sailed to Piraeus for a day of ship sightings and visits like no other. Part 5 is dedicated to one of the busiest ship-filled days of my lifetime. At dawn, we entered Piraeus harbor, following in the wake of Paquet Cruises' Mermoz. The wrecks of the Melody and PALLAS ATHENA ominously lay in the distance. In Kanelos, the ex-Soviet liner Armenia sat abandoned and half-gutted, while Golden Sun Cruises Arcadia followed us in. Ipiratiki Lines had several ships in port, including the 1962-built ODYSSEUS and the chartered 1966-built Olympic, which was still in existence in 2021 as Ocean Majesty. Meanwhile, television's original love boat, the Pacific Princess, made a sun-kissed approach to a neighboring berth. At the main terminal, a pair of Sunline beauties beckoned, the mini jewel Stella Oceanis and the legendary Stella Solaris, the queen of Greek cruise ships. We would also work in a quick visit to Ipiratiki's Neptune, moments before she sailed off to the Aegean. In Panama, we found Fiesta Marina waiting to be converted to Ipiratiki's next Olympic. And hidden in a long lineup of ferries at Carazzini, we found the damaged Sea Prince, the former Italia of 1967. From Carazzini, it was a bit of a trek to Petrola, where a trio of British-built liners owned by John S. Latsis included the former Oriole, the former Windsor Castle, and the former Principe Perfeito. In Elefsina, we captured the burnt-out Pegasus and other laid-up ships before returning to Piraeus to visit Intercruise's La Palma, the former Ferdinand de Lesseps. Our tour of the Achille Lauro's control room was originally to have been an engine room visit, but that changed, probably due to whatever was causing the flow of smuts from her funnels. The chief is explaining here that the ship had 8 diesels to power her 2 shafts.
1, 2, 3, 4 for the starboard side shaft. 2, 4 on each shaft, as you will like. Now we are running with all 8 engines.
Thankfully, just a couple years prior, my Australian friend Stanley Haviland took these photos of the Achille Lauro's well-worn 45-year-old engines. His tour even included a visit to the propeller shafts.
Oh, okay.
Meanwhile, near the end of our brief control room visit, the engineer showed us the bullet holes left by the Palestinian terrorists. After that, we were granted another visit to the bridge, which also had bullet holes from the 1985 hijacking. I loved how it creaked with the movement of the ship. The young officers even let us peek in at the chart room. Our behind-the-scenes look at the Achille Lauro ended with a few windy backlit moments on the starboard bridge wing. That evening, the captain, Giuseppe Orsi, hosted a farewell cocktail party in the Arazzi Lounge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are almost at the end of this cruise. It has been wonderful to know you, to meet you on board this ship.
In just a few short weeks, our kind host would be put to the ultimate test in evacuating the burning ship. He would be the last to leave.
Nice memories of this experience at sea, and looking forward to meet you again on this blue lady in the not too distant future. I wish you all a very, very happy landing and a safe journey to your final destinations. Thank you and arrivederci.
When the farewell party ended, we proceeded to the dining room, where the food, especially the Italian specialties, was superb.
I'll have everything on the right side.
And speaking of superb, our waiter Raffaelli had literally served aboard the Achille Lauro for decades. He even patiently endured our tipsy antics and steered me clear of a dish I didn't know had meat in it.
No? There's meat in it? Thank you for telling me. Thank you. Yeah, tomato sauce. And the lobster. Yes. Please.
To this day, some 27 years later, I still relish the pasta dishes served in that room. Just beyond that magnificent brass frame porthole behind us was the Strait of Messina. Achille Lauro was entering her home waters. Ah, the Achille Lauro. For all of her quirky faults, she had a homey spirit about her that is so often missing aboard today's corporate-controlled cruise fleet. Even her passengers had a Fellini-esque flair. Out on deck the next morning, we learned the ship was entering Naples due to high swells off Capri, our intended port of call. For a brief moment I was mildly disappointed until I spotted two ships on the horizon. The first to approach was the handsome Regent Spirit, which was originally the Brazilian coastal liner Anja Neri. She was built in Yugoslavia in 1962. And even more intriguing was the Christian missionary ship Doulos, one of the oldest ships in the world, originally the 1914-built cargo liner Medina. As the ACHILLE LAURO backed into her berth, we spotted the overly rebuilt Tirrenia ferry Petrarca. The Regent Spirit was headed for the Stazione Marittima. I would next see the remarkable Petrarca on the Scrappers Beach at Alang in 2005. The Doulos gave us quite a show as she pivoted and backed into her berth at the opposite end of Stazione Marittima. As the Lauro Line theme song La Nave Blu played over ACHILLE LAURO's sound system, I marveled at Doulos, whose overall form actually dated to her first conversion to a passenger ship in 1948. At this time in her career, the Doulos was mostly based in African waters. What serendipity it was that she made this trip to Naples and that the sea conditions off Capri brought us together that morning. I just had to get aboard, or at least give it my best shot. We rushed over to Stazione Marittima and made our plea. While her staff mulled over our request, I took some up-close footage. Between 1952 and 1977, the Doulos sailed for Costa Line as the Franca Sea. The bead welding of her former name was still visible between the Doulos letters on her bow. Although they weren't yet prepared for visitors, the staff graciously granted us a quick visit. I'll dedicate a full video to this important ship, but one of the highlights was seeing the Enrico Paolucci panel in her stair tower. Paolucci was a favorite artist of Costa Line's architect Nino Zancata, one of Italy's most prolific 20th century designers. Up on deck, the Franca Sea's once bustling pool area in Lido was now a Christian bookstore that was for the moment covered in tarps. We took in the views, both fore and aft, from the bridge wing, marveling at the ship's vintage architecture. And in the wheelhouse, there was an egalitarian combination of old and, let's say, relatively new equipment. Another great discovery was her Ansaldo builder's plate for her transformation into the liner Roma in 1949 and then Franca Sea in 1953. Our patient hosts even granted us a visit to the forecastle for one of my favorite face shots. Back inside in the dining room, I was thrilled to find some Costa-era ceramics by the legendary Genoese artist Emanuele Luzzati. Remarkably, in 2008, the Doulos was purchased by a man named Eric Saw, who converted her into the Doulos Foss Ship Hotel on the Indonesian island of Bintan, where she rests today. It was now time to return to our beautiful blue ship, which we did, but first stopping on the other side of Stazione Marittima for a close-up look at the Regent Spirit and the utterly shockingly rebuilt Petrarca. Some, of course, would disagree, but I personally don't think the Achille Lauro had a bad angle. After Regency Cruises' bankruptcy in 1995, the Regent Spirit was sold to Cyprus-based Salamis Lines, who operated her as the Salamis Glory until she was scrapped in 2010. As we sailed out of Naples, we spotted the handsome ferry Carlo R, which was the former New Zealand ferry Rangiatira. Leaving Vesuvius in her wake, Achille Lauro turned northward towards Genoa. Before long, she was passing the rugged coastline of Campania. Reluctantly, we would have to head inside and begin the tedious process of packing and preparing to disembark the following morning. In the 11 days since we left Genoa, the American adventure was looking much more like the Costa Riviera. With her port side freshly painted white, only the logo on her funnel was evidence of her short tenure with American Family Cruises. Just beyond at the San Giorgio del Porto shipyard, the brand new Silverwind was waiting for her funnel. And the Italia Prima, the 1948-built former Stockholm, was nearing completion after a complete rebuilding into a modern cruise ship. Directly behind her, the Costa Romantica and Premier's SS Oceanic were in dry dock. Greeting us from the other side of the historic Ponte di Mille cruise terminal was the Ukrainian cruise ship Gruzia. Built in 1975, she was one of 5 nearly identical Bielorusia-class cruise ferries. After disembarking the Achille Lauro, we had time to explore Genoa, one of my favorite cities in the world. There was just enough time to ride the funiculare up Righi Hill for sweeping views of the harbor. On our return, as if predestined, we accidentally came across the former Flotoloro headquarters. Back at the harbor, we found the Achille Lauro and the Gruzia bathed in a golden afternoon hue. As the Achille Lauro cast her lines, we watched as the brand new Grimaldi ferry Splendid backed into her berth. And so spoke the Achille Lauro as she began her next cruise adventure. As that long, graceful bow pointed towards the Tyrrhenian Sea, we all vowed that we had to sail in the blue ship again. But that was obviously not to be. As she pivoted towards the harbor exit, her tumble home caught the rays of the gradually dimming sun. Ciao bella, ACHILLE LAURO. Thank you again for watching, and if you haven't already, please hit like and don't forget to subscribe.